So good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us here tonight with Dr. Donica Dorwind. I'm so happy to have Donica joining us tonight. We've been working very closely for a number of years and referring clients back and forth because I just have so much respect for Donica's practice, and there is such an important role that the psychoeducational testing process plays in our ability to really support our students and understand what their needs are at the core. So I want to welcome you, Donica, and I'll let you, if you want to give any added introduction, go ahead before we jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. Like Megan mentioned, we've had a very great collaborative relationship. We all have a little piece of the puzzle. Our practice does the assessment, evaluation, and I'll speak to that tonight. Megan's practice does a lot of the support and a lot of the heavy lifting. I feel like I give her all of the what needs to be done, and Megan and her staff really could take it from there regarding learning and other types of supports.
Thank you. Thank you. So tonight it's going to be a kind of interview conversation. You guys as participants tonight have all submitted different questions. We've compiled all of those, and we'll make sure we are addressing them. But if there are any additional questions you have, we'd love to take them. And what we'll do is we will go through them through the chat feature. And if you are unfamiliar with it, if you just look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little bubble and it says chat underneath it. Just click on that, and I will go through those at any questions you've entered there at the end tonight. So just keep entering them as they come up. No problem if you enter them at any given time, and then we'll just go through them at the end. So with that, Donica, I just wanted to let you kind of give an opening introduction to just really explain to us about the assessment process. And how you guys approach that at Psychology 360.
Definitely. Yeah. Oh, now I hear. Okay, that helps. Okay, I was just making sure I heard a echo, but now I am good. Yeah, I don't have any PowerPoints or anything prepared. I really just wanted to make this conversation style. We got a lot of great questions that we're going to address. Just wanted to start with explaining our practice, the assessment process, what that looks like, what it entails, and then we can kind of open it up and I'll answer some of the provided questions and we can have others chime in with additional questions. So just as far as my practice, I'm a clinical psychologist and been in practice 5 years. Our practice specializes in psychoeducational and psychological evaluations. And we offer different types of evaluations. So essentially, families come to us when they want to learn more about their child. So more about learning style, if there's a learning disorder, and then covering in that, clarity on an attentional diagnosis, clarity on an emotional health diagnosis. We do social skills levels and autism screenings as well. And with that, and I'll explain what our process is, but essentially once going through our evaluation process, and I have a team of 4 clinicians, we're all part of the team, we work together. After a student is evaluated, we are able to determine if they meet criteria for a diagnosis in lots of different categories. So certainly learning, emotional health, behavioral health, attention, executive functioning, autism. So we help with diagnosis. I always say more important than a diagnosis would be really what strategies and supports can we put in place for the student. And in all of our reports, we divide that into sections, starting often with academic and school supports, and we have a list. And then we go into emotional behavioral health strategies and supports, and any other areas that we identified through the evaluation that we feel families can support their child. And we do a lot of collaborative referring out. We don't do any treatment at our practice. We work with a lot of amazing clinicians in the community, including Megan and La Jolla Learning Works and her team. So when we decide or we feel that an assessment has indicated that a student needs support in various areas, we identify and try to match that family with a number of clinicians that they can then interview and see who's a good fit. So that could be anything from psychiatrists to psychotherapy, therapy, to help with emotional health issues, of course, educational therapy and tutoring. We sometimes help with placement for either charter schools or private schools to determine who has a learning center that might really support this child. And then we warmly, as I said, collaborate. You know, these are private evals, so everything is confidential unless if a parent does sign a release, then I'm more than happy as part of the process to connect at any time and make sure that we have a warm handoff, that whoever's working with this child really understands our report. I know this is a lot for the child to go through. A lot of time and resources go into one of these evaluations. So I really want to make sure that they're nicely taken care of once they leave our office. So that also is a big piece. And over the years, it's been so amazing to form these collaborative relationships with other professionals in the community. I always think of it as a little bit of a Venn diagram where we all have our own circle, but we overlap. So I'm sort of the diagnostic piece, and then there's the treatment piece, and sometimes medication management. But it's been really amazing to have the knowledge of who these professional collaborative individuals are, so I can make sure that the families and the students are really supported. So that's the kind of overview as far as what an evaluation looks like. Just real briefly, as far as logistics, a typical comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation occurs over 2 sessions, and it's a total of about 5.5 hours of testing. So 2 hours in our office, 5.5 hours. And then we also send teacher survey, parents surveys, tutors surveys. We collaborate with anybody that's involved. We also review previous records. And then 2 weeks after our final testing session, we have a parent-only feedback session, which is about an hour long. And that is our opportunity to review, go through everything, talk about next steps and where we can kind of get supports for the student. So that is the process and what it looks like. Megan, do you want me to speak on a little bit of the types of evaluations, like the differences? Do you think that's a nice next step to?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know, actually before we dive into like real specifics on like the types of assessments, I was curious if you can explain, because I know we get this question all the time from families, just more like what the difference is in a private evaluation versus what might be done in a school through an IEP process, and when they go through and have psychoeducational testing done by a school psychology team.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. So the school is looking at things a little bit differently than we are as a clinical psychologist. So the school, typically, they are trying to identify students that aren't able to access the general education curriculum. And if they are deemed not to, then they agree to sort of evaluate that student. And they have 13 different type of criteria where they can put that student under in order to get supports. So that often looks like an IEP or a 504. So they're not really diagnosing insofar as a real diagnosis, but they are placing that student under a category. Other health impairment, or AUT is for the autism type criteria. So it's not a real diagnosis, but it is a way to get support in the public school system. So that's their lens. As a clinical psychologist, we are absolutely diagnosticians. We do diagnose, we do a lot of times for insurance and for support. There needs to be some type of diagnosis and a code. We're considered an out-of-network provider, so we can provide all of that information to the family. So if the student meets criteria for a diagnosis, we can put that in there along with the codes that we use for the eval. And so a diagnosis is in there. And also our benchmark is a little bit different. We don't necessarily think an individual should wait to fail to be evaluated, because we feel that as clinical psychologists, if we can catch a disorder before somebody is failing, and therefore they can remediate earlier, which then they don't have to fail to prove that they have this issue. So we kind of can catch things a little bit easier. So it is definitely a different lens as far as the private eval versus the school eval.
So would you say, is there any purpose or could you explain, what the purpose might be if somebody's already had an evaluation done through public schools to then go through and do a private evaluation?
Yeah, so there's two different ways that families typically come to us after the school has evaluated. One way is that the family feels some area of either the process or the resulting determination of the process they're not pleased with. They feel like something was missed in the eval, or they're not getting enough support, in which case the family has the right to request through the district that they can ask for, it's called an IEE, which stands for Individual Education Evaluation. And if the school agrees to that, and again, sometimes it does take a little bit of making your voice known to the school that you're unpleased for certain reasons, but if the school agrees to that, then we also do those evals, and the district actually funds those evals. So it is, but we are a private entity, so we treat it like a private evaluation. So essentially the child is getting a private eval, it's just paid for by the district. So we still diagnose, we still talk about all the strategies in and out of school that I'd recommend, but the only difference is that the school pays, and then we have to send that report to the school, and then the school sits. They generally have a kind of a round table team meeting that I also attend, and we try to come to an agreement. We say, okay, we have your school eval, private eval, what can we agree on how to support this student going forward? And in my case, it's been pretty collaborative. And when it's not, we have supports like advocates and special ed attorneys.
Wonderful, thank you. And, then I guess like we can kind of back up a little bit to talk about, what kind of, types of evaluations you do offer then. And then I have some questions that people submitted about like what your approach is for testing on like certain types of evaluations.
Yes, for sure. So with the private evaluations, the majority of what we do, we refer to as a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. And that really looks at 3 areas of functioning. We assess for cognition, working memory, processing speed. We assess for learning strengths, challenges, ruling in and out of learning disorder. And then we also assess for attention, executive functioning, and emotional health and behavioral health. So it's looking at all those 3 areas through self-report, face-to-face assessment, parent survey, teacher survey, involved professionals input. That's the majority. Probably 75% of what we do are the comprehensive psychoeds. That's a pretty streamlined process that does take about 5.5, 6 hours face-to-face testing, turnaround time 2 weeks after the test. In some cases, for whatever reason, we might not need to explore learning. Parents, we really are only looking at attention, executive functioning, or emotional health, in which case we refer to that as more of a psychological eval. So there's not really the learning piece, the child's doing well, and they've made it up through grades without any indication of a learning disorder. That cuts down a little bit on the time frame and the fee. So that's referred to as we refer to them as a psychological eval. So that would be like an ADHD eval, or if you're concerned with depression or any other mood or anxiety disorder. Sometimes we do just autism battery, if that's one area. So that would be under the umbrella of a psychological evaluation.
Great. And then I guess more specifically, so one question was, how would you determine if my child has dyslexia?
So in order for us to identify a specific learning disorder, and let me just back up a little bit. So we diagnose using the DSM, that's our psychiatric manual, and learning any type of dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, they're actually under the umbrella of what's called a specific learning disorder. So we are diagnosing for a specific learning disorder, and dyslexia is sort of like underneath that category because it's a type of specific learning disorder related to reading. And we do evaluate for that through, we compare, the whole battery needs to be looked at to really look. I wish there was like a dyslexia test. Parents are like, no, we just want to rule in or out dyslexia, but we do have to compare it to like cognitive scores. We do have to administer the entire achievement battery to look at discrepancies. And then we do have some screeners for dyslexia where we're showing pictures. Do you see this? And then self-report questions related to your eyes fatigue. Are you sensitive to certain lights and things like that? So it's a combination of face-to-face and then some self-report, teacher input, reading fluency, lots of different things we look at. So if we're wanting to roll
when you're talking
out,
about the visual side, you're talking about ruling out there being a visual impairment, right?
Right, exactly. So we have to rule that out. So it's those that come forward and want to determine if a student is meeting criteria for a type of dyslexia, they would go through the psychoed process. And at the end of that, we'd have the data to say, this looks like maybe just an area of challenge, or it looks like, yes, it meets criteria for that. Yeah. And I always say more important than just meeting criteria for an SLD, which is specific learning disorder, is really how it's presenting. So that when I take that client and give them, to an educational therapist, we don't just want to know that that child has a dyslexia. We want to know, is it related to phonemic awareness? Is it more of like an auditory phonemic issue? Is it a reading fluency because there's teaming and tracking and visual processing issues? There's so many little pieces, and in order for the therapy and the ed therapy and the tutoring to be most effective, we want to identify exactly the areas of weakness, not just like SLD. So really that's the value that's why it's so intense, because you guys, I know, can create your treatment plan based on looking at all these little subtests that we gave.
And I mean, I totally appreciate the value in that too, because we oftentimes will see a student, where, they may show that they're really anxious on the surface, and, they've been working with a psychologist for a while to address more of that emotional side. And we've been referred those students, because a psychologist starts thinking, I think there's actually something that's making this child so anxious, because it's getting in the way of them being able to function in school. And, that's where we've had things uncovered, whether it's, an ADHD, an attentive, issue, or executive functioning, or sometimes it's actually been a specific learning disability. And I know that's, something that, can oftentimes be associated with, depression and anxiety, because it's so hard to go through school with those challenges. And that's your life, you're dealing with in and out. So I'm going to be doing a webinar next month where we dive in and we do more of like a firsthand simulation of some of the different learning disabilities and executive functioning challenges. So parents kind of experience that and see like more like what are those aspects that impair your functioning when you have those kinds of disabilities. So I think that'll be helpful to give parents, some idea of, outside of like the, professional lingo, what does it really look like or feel like to have those disabilities?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That's great.
Yeah. And then I guess going beyond SLD, I mean, what would it look like for you to be evaluating ADD, ADHD?
Yeah, we have, again, a type of battery. For ADHD, there's some markers that we look at, like working memory. We do have some objective computer-based measures in an auditory and visual condition that give us really good data about processing speed and can a student attend to a non-preferred task for an extended time. So we get some objective data. Self-report measures, teacher surveys are amazing in these circumstances specifically, only because I always think they have this baseline every year, and the outlier percentage they really can identify, especially in the elementary school years, those outliers related to, does this look like inattention or hyperactivity? So value that tremendously. And then really pulling it all together and going through the DSM, and if you hit a certain amount, that threshold tips you into a diagnosis of a mild, moderate, or severe ADHD.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I know. I oftentimes, hear parents with like concerns about attention, and it's I think sometimes they have a confusion about whether or not it's a real problem, or it's just like their child just doesn't like listening to them, or it's, some sort of like more defiance, more intentional. So I think that's helpful. I think it's also helpful to understand that there are different degrees of it too. And I'm curious, what do you see, or how do you explain to parents differences between the types of ADHD, between like inattentive and hyperactive?
Yeah, so with the DSM-5, which is how we diagnose, there's no more ADD. What they did was they call all of it ADHD now, but they've just changed the qualifiers. So it's all ADHD, but it can either be inattentive presentation, hyperactive presentation, or combined. So, and it is, based on the symptoms and such, it's predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, or combined. And based on how many symptoms in each category, we would determine what category that they would fall into as far as the qualifiers for that diagnosis.
That's great. Thank you. I think there is a lot of confusion because of like the old ADD, distinction, but basically what used to be ADD is now just called ADHD inattentive type.
Perfect. Right? Yes, exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it looks like for you guys to do an autism evaluation? I know you alluded to that. That can be a standalone evaluation, is that right? But it also can be part of the full psychoeducational testing, comprehensive testing?
Yes, it can either. So it can be a standalone if somebody wants clarity, for sure. Sometimes having that diagnosis can actually help an individual get supports. So even if family said so and doctor had written it down somewhere, sometimes with insurance, if there's not it in a formal eval, they can't get supports. So we do the full battery to determine that. As well, it can be sort of added on to a comprehensive psychoed. It's a little bit additional. Typically, we don't include an autism battery in a psychoed. That's the one piece that we really don't. That would be a specific request. We have a battery.
What kind of warning signs or symptoms, I guess, would you be like listening for or looking for? And I know you do a very thorough intake process and questionnaire and all of that. So what are you looking for, and where you might recommend, and I guess, or do you, if a parent isn't specifically requesting it, might you recommend to add on that battery if you are seeing certain, signs of a potential, issue in that area?
Yeah, and usually those cases do occur more. Sometimes there's, very borderline circumstances. There's no more Asperger's either. So sometimes, they feel an adolescent might have met criteria for Asperger's, or if you're hearing parents speak of, they're just not transitioning well through adolescence and puberty, that can be maybe a time they want to get reassessed to rule in or out that ASD. Of course, with a younger child, usually the pediatrician is on it with missing developmental milestones. So that's kind of more clear cut and easier. But I do think with the later years, it would be, the not understanding sarcasm, never forming that really tight group that you'd assume by adolescence you'd have, having trouble just navigating that. Those are the times where we might want to, and other times families, they might have those concerns, but they don't necessarily need that rule in or rule out. And we just focus on other things then. They don't necessarily need to do it. It's a private eval, so it's parent request and parent initiated, but we'll have that conversation if we see signs during our conversation at intake that should we explore this more.
That's great. Because I know, parents don't always know, what they are looking for,
right?
Or what the full spectrum of possibilities could be, I guess, that would be impairing a child's functioning. So that's great to know that you do kind of coach them through that and help them figure out what's the best. Because I always feel like the more comprehensive the testing, the better. Because we don't ever want to miss anything for a child, or be working on something and find that we're just not super effective because there's some underlying anxiety, or or whatever else it might be, or underlying inattentiveness because you were just looking for the learning disorder. And those things for us are always, I feel like the more information the better is always super helpful for our perspective. So thank you for that. And, you know, I guess just to kind of segue to the times right now, you know, what does your guys' process look like today with, you know, virtual versus in person? And, you know, are you equipped to do all testing virtually? And, you know, can you also do it in person, I guess?
Yeah, so our practice is back to face-to-face testing, just using the typical protocols for sanitizing and such. So we are able to assess back in our office. We're in the Serena Valley area. We also, in some cases, we can do remote evaluations, and we have. It's a little bit more involved. We have to ship out a FedEx with testing material. And there's a couple batteries that, like the computer-based battery, we can't yet administer remotely. But to look at learning disorders and to look at anxiety or emotional health, we can do that. We can do that remotely. Autism, no, because we need to use an ADOS, which is one of the gold standards for assessing autism, and that's not approved yet to do remotely.
Okay.
So that would have to be in office, yeah.
Very good to know. These are all things we never really thought we'd be asking about, you know, a year ago, but here we are. I mean, it's great to know that, you know, we have families now enrolled in our virtual school from all across California, and even, you know, some that are out of state, and, you know, clients that are coming to our learning center, honestly, from across the country. So
that's amazing.
it's really, yeah, I know it is.
Cool. Yeah.
A silver lining of this whole situation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So kids, yeah.
But, you know, it's nice to be able to offer the full gamut of services to them too. So I guess just some more specific questions that came up. I guess this is thinking of a child who might have already been assessed, but how would you know if your child needs to have another evaluation to move forward with more effective support? And I guess that also kind of leans on, like, what's the, you know, frequency that a child should be assessed and reassessed?
That's a great question. So typically the standard, and a lot of schools adhere to this, is that these evaluations are valid for 3 years. So probably a student wouldn't need to go through the extensive evaluation for 3 years. Sometimes there's bits and pieces we want to do baseline testing, like on an achievement or on attention and focus a year later. But as far as receiving supports, typically they're able to get all the supports. And I try to, when we write up our recommendations, I try to think immediate, but also long-term. So I try to, you know, let's say an emotional health issue, I'll start conservative. I'd start with this therapist. He specializes in children and ADHD. If that doesn't work, I'd consider reaching out to a pediatric psychiatrist to consider med management. If that, you know, I try to think that these families will use these reports, which are, you know, 18, 20 pages for the next couple of years at least, and kind of refer back, oh, we've tried this, it's escalated, or maybe we no longer need this. Now we can downgrade. So that's the frequency with which typically we see, and we see kids kind of rotating back when they need updated evals certainly for standardized assessments. When it comes to those high school years, they're very strict with that 3-year mark. But other times schools, some private schools included, they can just sort of keep accommodating until there's a shift, or it's been like 3 or 4 years, and then they would refer for an updated.
Great. Well, since you mentioned the standardized testing, can you tell me a little bit about what that would look like as a process for a student, you know, to be evaluated in order to get accommodations for testing? And I know there's different cases for that. I've seen cases where things, you know, don't really come to a head for a student to prompt any kind of evaluation until they're at that level in high school, and, you know, taking these tests and start really struggling with the time aspect of it. And then you have the students that, you know, have had diagnosed, you know, challenges and identified needs for a very long time and have a wonderful paper record and are just in that position, like you said, of just needing the only thing is to make sure it's within 3 years. So how would you handle that, you know, for somebody who, I guess, is in the first use case and then the second use case of,
Definitely. Yeah, there are, you know, we have identified learning disorders and ADHD in high schoolers for the first time. Sometimes, you know, bright kids that have held it together and have accommodated and compensated in different ways, it doesn't always come across in school that they had a mild learning disorder or they had a mild ADHD. So we really do, we specialize in that area because it really does, they need to go through the full battery. We connect with their teachers, you know, we really dig in to see, wow. And sometimes I'm sort of surprised and I'm like, wow, yeah, we really identified something that if you haven't gone through it, it's understandable. But I'm like, oh my goodness, I wish we identified you earlier. But, you know, for whatever reason, they're not here till high school. And so we do the full eval, diagnose. If the ACT or SAT, you know, sometimes they are suspect and say, hey, where's the paper trail? Where's the history of concerns? We've written letters, we've gotten letters from tutors and teachers. So sometimes an appeal with a little bit of extra buffer and support, then I see those cases going through with approval for extra time for College Board and ACT.
Oh, that's so great to know.
Yeah.
So great to know. Because I know that's something, you know, we're always suggesting parents to just like start the testing as soon as possible to get that paper trail. But like you said, you don't always know. And
yeah,
like you said, some kids work so hard and they can just go under the radar. And it's not until they get into that really rigorous, you know, timed setting that it starts to really show the difference. So that's wonderful to know.
Yeah, and on that note, I always explain to parents, I'm not the end all be all for approval for the extra time on standardized tests. That's what we're going to shoot for. You know, we're going to identify these challenges. But again, if they're coming to me, you know, sophomore, junior year, these reports are good for 3 years. Colleges are very accommodating, more so than high schools. So I kind of say, as a backup, if we don't get extra time on this, your child freshman year can go with a plan. And any school from, like, I've worked at the Ivy Leagues to the community colleges, everything in between, they really have learning centers. They want their students to graduate. It looks good for their numbers. They're very supportive. So they have things like note sets, extra time, quiet space, tutoring for free on campus, lectures recorded for them, scribes, you know, there's all sorts of supports. It's like very robust. So, you know, that, and then that, okay, this wasn't for nothing, right? We didn't get what we wanted from ACT, but my child's going to have support learning center freshman year, which can be huge for a child, right?
Yeah.
With any kind of challenge. Yeah.
And I'll tell you a personal anecdote on that note. My sister, actually, she didn't have she was one of those cases. She had learning disabilities diagnosed her junior year in high school when she was struggling with the testing, and, you know, the youngest kid in the family, big difference in age. And, you know, my mom basically was her like full-time tutor and read all of her homework for her, typed all of her writing for her, you know, all through high school. And then she got where she had to go to the SAT by herself and couldn't do it. And so, yeah, she did not get accommodations for SAT, but she did get the all of the accommodations for college. And I think it probably helped with her getting into college to have that, you know, explanation of here's why my scores don't look so hot. And I will say then, you know, to fast forward, having that documentation, that paper trail for her, she ended up going through law school and going so far as getting accommodations for LSATs, getting accommodations for the board. And so, you know, I think, you know, there's definite like lifelong, you know, purpose, you know, and starting testing whenever you can.
Yeah.
And I always saw that too with like the private school admissions, because we do so much work with kids, you know, in previous years where they had to take the ISCE test for private school, where, you know, they'd come out testing super low in a section and parents would be like, I thought they were great readers. What's going on here? And, you know, we would just, you know, recommend to go forward with like a little bit more testing and, you know, see what we could uncover. And often cases we did find that there were some sort of underlying learning challenges. So it's also, I think there's a great purpose there for doing that. So yeah, so here's another question to kind of segue. You know, I had somebody write in, what would show up in some sort of psychoeducational evaluation that would lend towards a recommendation for a residential treatment center? And maybe you can explain a little bit about what is a residential treatment center.
Yeah, so residential treatment center, and I see Kelly Corey is on here, and she put a little chat box about with accommodations, you can get early registration as an accommodation, which is huge at some colleges. So thank you, Kelly, and thanks for being here. So a resident, well, I'm sorry, was it a therapy? You mentioned a residential treatment center type for.
So just thinking, I wanted to know what would come up in one of your evaluations that would lend towards a recommendation of a residential treatment center?
Okay, so a couple of things, and you know, with our adolescents, we're really doing a deep dive on emotional health, self-esteem, substance use. You know, we do have screeners when vaping, you know, alcohol. We really get a good baseline if there's any concerns. And even now more, even there's not concerns, we kind of throw in screeners and ask questions of 15, 16, 7-year-olds about vaping and alcohol. You know, some of it might be developmentally appropriate, some not. So it's good to get a baseline. So when we see that students, you know, are not finding success in whether it's the access to the public schools, and maybe they've tried different charters or privates, and their emotional health issues, substance use issues, self-harm, of course, then we feel like it's reached that level where I like to work with school consultants like Kelly Corey and others. They really then they know the placements near and far. They can look at a report and know where, based on everything, you know, cognition, achievement, emotional health, and all the areas that we're exploring related to personality and self-esteem and self-concept, what would be a good fit. And so that's, yeah, we really try to just get clarity on diagnosis and symptoms. And then we would refer out, because I'm just not familiar. I know there's so many, and it is cross country. Yeah. Boarding school and such. So yeah, that's really when to get an expert involved. So I'm kind of like the first step, and then we, you know, as far as the assessment piece, and then kind of they work with one of those professionals like Kelly.
And does that process, Donica, for your guys' assessment, does it include screening for like eating disorders too?
Yes, like it really, so we do, prior to us working with the individual, parents both complete a developmental history form. So there's lots of questions. So anything, like we really try to craft the battery. We have a pretty standard template, but for example, like if OCD was the problem or eating disorders, there's certain surveys and questions that we would ask that aren't part of a standard battery. So we can go a little bit deeper. So we really try to tailor it to the referral question, the purpose of the eval, and what are the areas of concern. But yeah, certainly like those things like trauma, going through trauma, PTSD, eating, OCD, there's some add-on assessments. It's part of it, but we include certain things. We have a focus on those areas.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have some questions about supporting students once we've, you know, uncovered that there is an issue like you've been discussing tonight in your assessment process. And I actually I thought this was a good question. I like this one. This was from a parent who says, what is the single worst thing and the single best thing a parent can do when trying to support a 6th grader with ADHD and attentive? And I know that's very specific, but I have a feeling that there's some generalization to like supporting any child with, you know, adolescent struggles, but also, you know, with where that may cross over for emotional, you know, challenges and just the general ADD, you know, ADHD and attentive kind of challenges that come up.
Yeah, and I was like, I hope she doesn't ask me that question. I was like, the one on there is like, that's a really good question, but it's like hard. But I will answer it. So 6th grader, I was going to say age is huge. So the first step really is to get a baseline on so a child has ADHD, but a baseline on what can he control within that diagnosis and what not. And sort of that's what we try to do. And parents are always like, am I pushing too hard? Am I not pushing enough? I think the first step is to look at where that child is. Like, for example, with executive functioning stuff, you know, are they just spacey, or is there some defiance with not listening and not wanting to go through the multi-step directions or not wanting to follow rules? So that's the first thing. So the best thing a parent can do is really to get a really good baseline on the actual abilities within their child, like, and kind of rule out the 6th grade. So rule out kind of attitude and adolescent and like a developmentally appropriate stuff, kind of ruling that out and then keeping them accountable. And I guess on the same token, I mean, the worst thing would be sort of expecting too much and creating, having the bar too high, where I see some well-meaning and loving families are like, they're not aware of what it feels like to have an attentional and executive functioning disorder. And therefore they're like, no, why can't they just follow this? Now we're grounding, we're taking away screens, we're taking away phones. And it's almost unfair a bit, because I don't know if that 6th grader has the skill set yet or has the tools to be able to meet those parents' expectations.
That's a wonderful answer, Donica. I'm so glad I asked you that question.
I know, like, don't ask me that, but I guess it worked out.
Well, I mean, even and I was just kind of jotting down, what would I say for that one too? And I think, like I would say, I think you did a much more articulate job of explaining it. But to sum up, I think the best thing is to put in place some structure and some support, and identify specific skills that you can offer, connect with outside resources to help with, whether it's social skills, whether it's, just individual emotional control processing, whether it's academic skills and executive functioning tools. And the worst thing you can do is to blame it on laziness or do nothing.
Right.
I would say.
That's gret. Yeah, I agree.
And, that leads into a question about what parents can do how parents can help with executive functioning issues. And I think, I'd love to hear what your take is on that, but, we do so much work with kids with executive functioning issues. And for us, the biggest hindrance in seeing progress is parents, not wanting to be a part of the process. And, knowing we need parents to put in structure. We need parents to understand that these kids aren't kids that, can do these things on their own, and, need reminders, need parents to put up boundaries and say, guess what? No doing that extra thing with your friend, or, no cell phone in the bedroom while you're doing homework because it's distracting you, because, in most cases, these are kids who, in some way or another are not able to, make those good decisions for themselves or control those behaviors. So, I see, just even like sitting with a child and thinking, modeling for them how to organize a task list, or modeling for them, how to, clean out a backpack or a binder, and setting it up as a routine where, I feel like that's like the best thing if a parent can, create a calendar and say, hey, Sunday evenings or Sunday afternoon before you're too tired, we are going to have this routine where we sit down together and we look at the calendar and we update it together, and we talk about, what you have coming up this week and how I can help as a parent, whether that means, you need, your favorite snack because it's going to make you happier when you have to have an extra long study session, or, you have tutoring and it puts you in a bad mood because you're tired, and what can I do to help, but just, having those conversations, because that's the process of executive functioning, is thinking those things through. And so, as a parent who is capable of doing that, the more they can model and support it with their child, I feel like that's the best case scenario.
100%. I totally agree. I think executive functioning is absolutely behavioral skills and supports and scaffolding. That is the way to improve with executive functioning. Executive functioning is not a disorder. It's not in the DSM. It's nothing that's freestanding. Sometimes it can be associated with other diagnoses like ADHD or autism, but it is not a freestanding diagnosis, because I think in part it's so behavioral. Like these strategies can absolutely be learned over time. And there are so many different strategies. And I agree. I always say it has to be at home and with an ed therapist. Like that's the best combination, is really having both of those supports. But I've seen so much progress made in executive functioning with that consistent support. It's one of kind of the easier, like when I see lots of executive functioning, I'm like, oh, great, we can look at this. When I see severe depression, I think we can work on this, but it can be more challenging. Depression can be a lifelong struggle, medication, therapy. So with executive functioning, it's really all behavioral. It's learning and tools and techniques and strategies that hopefully, I always say we have all these years until college, and by the senior year, we hope that we've formed that set strong enough so that they can find success, when they launch. So, but I love the support that your team really offers for those students that need it.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, we've had the privilege of being able to see kids now go through that whole process, like you said, and launch to college and be successful, on their own, with having developed those skills through the years with us too. So That's exciting. I have a great question from a parent that shared this with me privately that I get so often, and I would love your take on this. Can you speak to what parents might share with their child about their results or diagnosis? And, do you tend to give the named diagnosis, or do you prefer to describe it without attaching a label? And, how much is helpful to share or too much, both for their understanding and esteem without it becoming an excuse or an out. And I know that's often a concern too, as parents are going, oh, I don't want my child just to be like, oh, I can't do that, I have ADHD, or, oh,
Right.
sorry, I didn't have good grades, but it's my ADHD. So yeah, what's your take on that? And
Yes, that is a great question. I think age and developmental stage is really first and foremost to consider with is what we share with a child. Typically, the way that our process works is I give all the feedback to the family. And if they are working with a tutor or a therapist, then the therapist generally shares some of the pieces of what we learned in eval in a safe, in that safe and validating environment. Sometimes parents want me to have a follow-up child session, and I can do that as well. As far as what to share, with youngers, I don't know that I certainly don't show any student the whole report, really. Even high school, it's medical documentation. It's really for the family to decide and keep safe, and kind of they don't really need to go through all. Some kids get bogged down on IQ scores and things like that, and we don't want that. So I don't show the documentation, but definitely for the youngers, like elementary school age, speaking in strengths and challenges. Related to, I always, in each report, I identify strengths in each report. So cognitive strengths, achievement, academic, and emotional health strengths and such. So, these are your strengths, and definitely challenges. If they have a challenge with fluency, or if they're, working memory, everything's slipping out, I speak to that and use it by name of memory, it's called working memory. Sometimes for you, it comes out real quickly. What are strategies we can use? We can jot things down. And so I do speak strengths and challenges with the younger kids. It later elementary, middle school, it's really a family's kind of decision. Some people find comfort in saying, yes, I have a type of dyslexia, because there's support groups, and they're in middle school now, and it's not going to impact their self-esteem, and the families are secure with that. So they decide to share that information. So it's not something I would hide forever either, but I would really play it each year and kind of reassess where that child is if they're inquiring. And, sometimes diagnoses are on the cusp. And so it may not be a concern in later years. So we don't want to have a child overly identify or attach to anything.
Yeah. I like that approach, of identifying more the specific skills or the specific aspects of, what are impacted by that diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And also, like you said, I mean, I've seen kids who are so relieved to know it's called dyslexia.
I know, right? Yeah, I'm like, oh, I thought I was stupid. I hear that all the time.
Well,
it's like validating.
Yeah, it demystifies what they really
Right.
attach to, like, I'm dumb, I'm stupid. And when you can say, you're very, very smart, like dyslexia is a learning disorder that is in contrast to, your intelligence, like that is, I think, a relief to them in many ways. So yeah, I think I agree. There's something to be like very personalized about that approach, but I love what you explain and how you address that. Yeah, so just looking over, I think we've addressed a lot of the questions that we had here. One other question I had for you, because we do have a minute or two here still to chat, was, if you have any kind of specific recommendations, and you can definitely lean back on me on this one, but this parent did share a question of how to better help a child with dyslexia.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, as I said, we really assess, diagnose, get a baseline in the specifics and the specific subtypes of dyslexia. And then we really hand it off. And yes, I mean, you definitely can speak to this. Absolutely. And educate. And I do some kind of educating parents on the difference between a tutor and an educational therapist, so that, if you're not in that world, and I didn't know either, I learned that there's different training, and there's difference between supporting a student academically and remediating a learning disorder. There's a difference. It's a different approach. It's different strategy. And I've done just like learning and through our conversations about what you do and what that looks like. So I kind of start in here in the session about explaining the difference and then sending referrals like La Jolla Learning Works. And then you guys hit the ground running.
We do.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, I mean, as far as, you know, how to better help a child with dyslexia, what parents can do, you know, you know, doing some of the accommodations, I think are so huge, and, you know, understanding especially the amazing technology that's out there now, and, you know, being able to utilize audiobooks and, you know, let these children who there's this wonderful, I'm spacing on the name, but this guy who was an adult with dyslexia who, you know, serves as like an advocate and, you know, inspirational speaker for kids who have dyslexia. And he specifies, he talks about reading as eye reading, ear reading, and finger reading.
Oh, okay.
And I love that, because what he said, where I'm not very good with eye reading, I'm wonderful with ear reading. And there's other people who can't do, you know, eye reading that are amazing with finger reading. And, you know, so I love that aspect of, you know, it doesn't have to be that you can't have access to this information, because that's what reading is about, is accessing information. And, you know, to lean into the audiobooks that are available, and, you know, maybe develop some skills if needed to support listening skills. But in many cases, kids who struggle with reading are very strong auditorially. And that's a strength to lean into that. And, you know, allow your child to sit and let you read a book to them. And I don't care how old they are, if they are able with the attention and, you know, the auditory processing to get the story, you know, and learn the vocabulary words and, you know, talk about lessons they're getting from text that they hear, that's a wonderful thing. And on the flip side of that, you know, thinking about writing a written expression when spelling's the hindrance, you know, and they can use some of the great programs out there for either speech to text or, you know, just spelling helpful, you know, spelling corrector tools. Why not, you know? And that's, you know, I love to be able to work with those kiddos and teach them how to read effectively and spell and write, you know, with a way that gives them a good sense of, you know, self-efficacy and, you know, confidence going out in the world. But, you know, those kind of things for parents to do at home, and just, you know, work with as an advocate to alleviate, you know, the stressors in their world, whether that's, you know, helping teachers understand what their child's difficulty is, or, you know, advocating to get the IEP in place at school. Like, those are the things that parents can do, you know, to be incredible support for their kids.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Definitely.
So I do have one final question for you then, to kind of go back to the testing piece and more in general. But when you do a private evaluation for, if you say you have a family that comes to you, and I know we oftentimes do have kids that just aren't identified in public schools, or they get some resistance to getting from their public school, they get some resistance to getting support, and they may come to you for testing. Or right now, I know a lot of the public districts are so backed up in testing because of COVID and being, you know, backlogged from the springtime. You know, if a family wants to get support through their school and, you know, do the private evaluation with you, do you know, can they use a private evaluation to then go to the school to request an IEP or request support?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they absolutely, sometimes if families, again, can't be assessed, or there's a long wait, or for whatever reason they don't necessarily want to start with the school, they can come to the school with a private evaluation. A school, in 100% of our cases, the school have at least initiated a 504 plan with a private eval. With a 504 plan, they don't need to do their own testing. They can initiate, you know, preferential seating, extra time, things like that. And if they see an outside eval from a clinical psychologist with a diagnosis and all these recommendations, usually that just entails one meeting where the school can draft a 504. With an IEP, they can't draft an IEP with a private eval. It can help initiate their IEP process, but the school has to do legally, the school has to go through their own testing. We give them a jump start insofar as none of the assessments are ethically can be redundant. So we oftentimes have done a little bit of the legwork And also a little bit of the strength. Parents are like, see here, something's going on, do what you need to, but we want our child evaluated, or we want an IEP. So they will consider our report, and it can sometimes give that strength to a parent's request, but they do a piece of the eval they have to do on campus with that child, and then they can draft the IEP.
That's wonderful. And when you say that they can't have redundancy, so that means
they can't like redo a cognitive measure within a year. So they would just accept my cognitive measure, and then they might do another, you know, there's a couple different types of achievement. They might do portions of a different achievement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically you're kind of helping them along the way.
Yes, we are assisting by decreasing the process that they have to then go through. Like, we've done a lot of the legwork. Parents have paid for it privately. So yeah, they're pretty willing to kind of take it from there and take it seriously, especially if a child does meet criteria for a diagnosis and a family's coming to the school and they're, you know, they consider that, they do, versus just, oh, I think my kid has ADHD.
Yeah.
You know, understandably, when they see the data, they really do kind of move. It can kind of make them be more motivated to move forward with their process. Yeah.
That's great. That's so helpful to know. And then, I mean, just to go back to where we were at the beginning of this conversation, then, you know, your point about the differences between that public testing and your private evaluation, you know, they're going to already have, you know, for a parent, they're already answering their big question of what is getting in the way of my child's success, and, you know, more concrete terms, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the end of the questions we had, and we are at the end of our time.
Timing, yeah.
I have learned some stuff tonight, I have to say.
Oh, yay.
It's always good to chat with you. I always get you know, new tidbits, but I know, you know, parents at home, and, you know, other professionals who've joined us tonight, this is just so helpful to hear, you know, more from your perspective. And I know you have so much respect for your very thorough and, you know, professional approach to this, and the work that you do to support parents and kids, and just helping them to get, you know, to the right places when they're having difficulties. So thank you for all that you do, Donica.
Thank you. And right back at you. I love when I hear families come your way, or if I refer a family. I mean, the feedback has always been amazing. I know your team just really takes care of the ones I send to you, so I appreciate that as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Before we sign off, I will just I'm going to give my own little plug that I am doing. The next webinar that we're hosting is me. And I do a presentation that was actually kind of created out of my years working for the volunteering, I should say, on the board of the International Dyslexia Association, and doing simulations of learning disabilities. And so we do I do a modified version of that, where we go through some different areas of learning challenges. And I actually have some interactive activities that parents can do, parents and professionals, whoever joins me, we can do from home, and, you know, get more of an experience of what it's like to have a learning challenge. And from that perspective, then I go through and I talk about, what does accommodation look like for this kind of disorder? What does remediation look like? And, you know, talk about what you can actually do as a parent to help your kid with those challenges. So I hope that everybody who, you know, joined us tonight, if you have any further questions, you'll join me for the next webinar. It'll be on December 8th, and we'll be sending out more information on it. So thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Donica.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for attending.
Yes, and we'll be sending out a recording of this for everybody who wasn't able to make it, and for everybody who was, so you can rewatch if there's any parts. And we'll also include, Donica, your contact information for everybody who, you know, may want to reach out to you with more personal questions.
Perfect. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Have a good rest of your night. Bye, everybody. Bye.